Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer and welcome to Write Better Stories. Today we're going to do a reading from The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, and I'm going to talk about how this can help you write better stories, but then also how this passage here basically describes what The Crying of Lot 49 is about as a whole, if that sort of thing is possible, because this is a book that's difficult to summarize, but then also that the passage can shed a little bit of light on Thomas Pynchon's general narrative perspective that he uses in almost every single book that he has, because he is considered an author that is notoriously difficult to read, but if you're familiar with just a couple concepts and intentions that he brings into his writing process, and I know intentions is a loaded word to use, but basically his philosophy that he brings in to his different narratives, I think we can get a better grasp on what he's trying to do and shine a little bit of light into the dark. Because I think too often people think, especially when something is confusing or kind of trippy, that it's just totally meaningless. It's like, whatever you want it to mean, who cares? It's like, oh, like you read Harry Potter and Harry Potter's the bad guy and Voldemort's the good guy. Like, we don't know. Obviously, you can tell by my sarcastic voice that I hard disagree with that perspective on most things. Now, Thomas Pynchon's work, I think, is not always really easy to categorize, but again, he is playing with scenic imagery still. He is still engaging in storytelling, and by basically tracking like the general things that I talk about on this channel, such as like character action, we can get a better idea about what these stories are about, even if they are incredibly confusing. So just for a little more preamble, the general vibe that I'm going to talk about is that in almost every one of Thomas Pynchon's books, he is dismantling traditional modes of understanding things, specifically scientific rationalism. And there's actually a really good line in this passage that I think demonstrates that pretty clearly. But a lot of times when people think of like academic writers, we think of like really strict, kind of boring, uptight interpretations of the truth. But Thomas Pynchon is anything but, even though he is considered very literary. So I could go on and really talk about this all day, so I won't. I'm just going to dive into this passage and then we'll point out some fun lines and then I'll tell you more. So this passage is about Oedipa and Metzger traveling to Lake Inverarity. Somewhere beyond the battening urged sweep of three-bedroom houses rushing by their thousands across all the dark beige hills, somehow implicit in an arrogance or bite to the smog the more inland somnolence of San Narciso did lack, lurked the sea, the unimaginable Pacific, the one to which all surfers, beach pads, sewage disposal schemes, tourist incursions, sunned homosexuality, chartered fishing are irrelevant, the whole left by the moon's tearing free and monument to her exile. You could not hear or even smell this, but it was there. Something tidal began to reach feelers in past eyes and eardrums, perhaps to arouse factions of brain current your most gossamer microelectrode is yet too gross for finding. Oedipa had believed, long before leaving Kinneret, in some principle of the sea as redemption for Southern California. Not, of course, for her own section of the state, which seemed to need none. Some unvoiced idea that no matter what you did to its edges, the true Pacific stayed inviolate and integrated or assumed the ugliness at any edge into some more general truth. Perhaps it was only that notion, its arid hope, she sensed as this forenoon they made their seaward thrust, which would stop short of any sea. They came in among earth-moving machines, a total absence of trees, the usual hieratic geometry, and eventually shimmying for the sand roads down in a helix to a sculpted body of water named Lake Inverarity. Out in it, on a round island of fill among blue wavelets, squatted the social hall, a chunky, ogived and verdigreed Art Nouveau reconstruction of some European pleasure casino. Oedipa fell in love with it. So I'm going to stop right there. This whole chapter and scene are really awesome, but there are so many things to talk about in there. I could make my entire channel about this scene, but why would I do that? So just to start out, I'm going to sort of summarize like the literal action of what is going on here, even though this scene, or this is kind of told in summary, just in the way that he's summarizing the sequence of events. But that summary does refer to actual character action, which is literally Metzger and Oedipa driving to a lake. So all of that fancy language is just dedicated to this drive, and then also to Oedipa's own like thoughts and perspectives. The literal character action word he uses is believed, so her beliefs on what she thinks about the Pacific Ocean. So it's a cool visual contrast that he creates between everything on land that is constructed by humans and then this beautiful Pacific Ocean. And I think that he's trying to make a thematic contrast, which I'll talk about in just a moment, but the actual visual contrast supports this thematic contrast, that we get all of these different like boxy houses and these sewage disposal schemes and tourism and gay people sunning on the beach. And then you have, and then also chartered fishing. But then you have the Grand Pacific that is in stark contrast to this. And I shouldn't have to tell you, but the Pacific Ocean was not made by anybody human anyway. We don't have to get into creationist myths, but the idea is that we have built all of these things on the shore that basically we think we can know. They're these confined spaces. I guess the people sunning on the beach doesn't really support that point that I'm making, but the rest of it scenically is giving you a lot of development and industry as a stark contrast to the natural beauty of the ocean. Now, and a lot of times when we're parsing a text and we're trying to pick out symbols, I think there are varying degrees of subjective correctness that you can have, or how arguable is it that a certain factor in the text means anything and any one thing over anything else. And especially in Pynchon, so many of his pieces of scenic imagery that he used end up being red herrings, or red herrings question, like we don't know, like he doesn't always tell us. But in this section, he literally says what the Pacific Ocean means to Oedipa. So we don't necessarily know what it might mean for the text in general, but since she's the main character, those things might as well be the same thing as far as I'm concerned. And she says, or he says, describing the way that she thinks and believes about the Pacific Ocean, that the unvoiced idea, no matter what you did to its edges, the Pacific stayed inviolate and integrated, or assumed the ugliness at any edge into some more general truth. So truth is obviously a very important word within this section, that you get all of Southern California's industry, which is apparently something that Oedipa feels that you need redemption from. It makes a mention of the fact that her home in Kinneret does not need to be redeemed. It's this kind of comfortable, safe suburban environment, but then you get into the Wild West of Southern California and you need to be redeemed from this. And apparently the truth of the Pacific Ocean is something that redeems Southern California for all of these things. So, believe it or not, that is just the sort of thematic framing that we're using in order to analyze the rest of this. And now I'm going to go a little bit more granular without making this video take too long to point out some interesting lines within this that have to do with that idea of truth and everything in between truth and what. Sometimes I just talk and I don't even know what I'm saying. So something that makes this passage a little difficult to understand too is just the language and the length of the sentences. But to reduce all of these clauses and these different examples and lists that he's using to something a little bit more digestible, this first sentence, somewhere beyond the battening urge sweep of 3-bedroom houses, and all of this imagery that's rushing by as they're making their way next to the Pacific, he's basically describing that there's something going on there that is beyond all of these tangible constructed things that we can understand. So we've got like the houses rushing by in the thousands, that we've got the smog, which you can see, we've got all of this stuff, and he's basically saying that the Pacific Ocean lurks somehow beyond all of these things, that it exceeds all of these human constructions that we have. And so if we are to take that the Pacific Ocean means the truth in some way, is that like the actual truth lurks somewhere outside of our traditional ways of constructing things. Now, I'm not saying that Thomas Pynchon would like read this passage and tell you that that's specifically what he meant by that. This is really just my interpretation of it, but I think it's pretty compelling, and I think more examples that I'll give within the text support that idea too. So again, all of this is the idea that somewhere beyond all of these constructions and implicit in an arrogance or a bite to the smog. Now, keep in mind that smog would probably not be traditionally measured as arrogant or to have a bite, and that seems a little bit silly for me to say about a work of fiction, because of course fiction is allowed to use poetic language and metaphor in order to describe something, but since he is talking about the truth here, I think it behooves us to look a little bit closer that he's not just using metaphor. He's basically saying everything in terms of like somehow. It's like, imagine if smog had an arrogance or a bite. Like, could you imagine that? This is lending more idea to the idea that he is specifically and intentionally trying to basically disarm us of any traditional modes of understanding things and inviting us to think about things in more symbolic terms, I would argue anyway. So basically we get this idea that the sea is somewhere, somehow lurking between all of this stuff, and that we get the surfers, the beach pads, the disposal schemes, the tourist incursions, the sun homosexuality, the chartered fishing. All of these things are irrelevant. That's specifically what he says, that they're irrelevant to this Pacific Ocean, somehow, somewhere lurking within all of that. That none of these knowable, tangible things are really relevant to this larger truth that he's trying to get at. And let's see. This is a really potent line too, that the moon's tearing free and monument, the hole left by the moon's tearing free and monument to her exile. I'm going to be honest, I don't totally understand what he means by that, or even what he's referring to. Yeah, in fact, I would invite you to put that in the comments. I could sort of make a guess right now that the sort of operative word there is whole, that it is this like lack, and that's sort of furthered by the idea of him referring this to like as an exile, that I'm not really sure what the moon would represent in this case though. But again, feel free to leave it in the comments if you feel like you can shed some light on that. But specifically, furthering this point of this idea of the general truth being something just out of our grasp, is that something tidal from the Pacific Ocean basically began to reach feelers past eyes and eardrums. And he said that it's something that you could not hear or even smell, but it was there. So again, it's like, this could just be poetic language of him having fun, or this could also be him drawing our attention to the fact that our traditional sensory modes for perception are not really going to be our best tools for understanding this general truth. We can't just look at it, observe it, run tests or anything in order to get it, but somehow, even in spite of all of our perceptual faculties, this truth is still somehow made known to us, or at least made known to Oedipa. And known might be too strong of a word. And then finishing this sentence is that he's saying that whatever was there that we couldn't hear or smell basically arouses factions of brain current that your most gossamer microelectrode is yet too gross for finding. And so, again, a microelectrode would be something that would be hooked up your brain to basically read brain activity. And gossamer, I'm not totally sure what that means off the top of my head, but what I take from this line is essentially that even the most advanced scientific graphs and machines are not going to be able to notice your brain noticing this thing. It is off the grid completely of science. And I could hammer that point home, but you get the idea. Oh, this is just like a brief anecdote that I heard in a philosophy class once, that kind of getting at the same idea of like scientific truth versus like experiential truth or some other kind of truth, is that science would tell you that a dream is something like this, is that like you go to bed, they hook micro electrodes up to your brain, and then they analyze the data, and then they put it on a graph, and they're like, hey, you had like this activity in that zone, and like here's some electricity up here in this region of the brain. And then my philosophy teacher basically screams at the top of his lungs, and he goes, that doesn't look like a dream at all. So obviously he was very unhinged, which is why I liked him a lot. But I think that pretty clearly demonstrates this sort of difference here. It's not to say that a scientific graph is dumb or wrong or anything like that, but it measures a very narrow spectrum of the truth that doesn't necessarily account for something as ethereal, experiential, and personal as a dream. So maybe that is helpful to you. I don't know. And then let's see. So I already kind of talked about her view of the truth that the Pacific Ocean represents, that it stays inviolate and integrated regardless of all of the industry and development along the shore. And she said, okay, so yeah, they make their seaward thrust. You get the idea. But then keep in mind, too, is that they're going to a lake called Lake Inverarity that is specifically a man-made lake. It's referred to as a sculptured body of water. And I'm going to go ahead and put the book down because that kind of finishes the explication. But basically the summary and scene and point that he is building for us right here is this idea that Oedipa believes that the Pacific Ocean represents this form of truth. And then here they're going to a man-made lake. So let's connect the dots a little bit here. If she believes that the Pacific Ocean is this basically completely unviolated, beautiful form of the truth, and they make their way to a man-made lake, what do you think this means about basically Oedipa's own investigation of this estate that she's supposed to act as the executrix of for Pierce Inverarity? I would argue that this means that whatever journey she is going on is a bit of a wild goose chase, is that she's going basically to a manufactured form of the truth that is mitigated by human understanding and construction. She seems to have some sort of feeling that she might be a psychic or a sensitive, I think it's called, at one point in the book, but then she's still forced to deal with basically the scientific, rational world that doesn't really make sense to her at any point in time. And as the book goes on, we get these different cases of like Dr. Hilarious kind of losing his mind, who is somebody that is considered like respected by society as a doctor, and then he basically says that fantasy is the most important thing, and he kind of renounces all of this scientific rationalism at the end, like I was saying. But before I get too lost in other examples from the book, this video is running a little long. I'll kind of wrap up and tell you how you can use this to write better stories. Is that theme and lofty ideas is something that always specifically attracted me to writing fiction, and I don't think I'm alone in that. People want to kind of commune with the gods and get the wisdom that has been passed down through the ages, but then it's a little disappointing sometimes when you get in a writing class and your teacher will be like, let's just focus on like character, summary, and scene, and just the nuts and bolts, and there's not always a lot of instruction about like how to insert bigger ideas or symbolic imagery into your fiction. And I think a lot of reason for that is that it's really hard, and it's also very difficult to teach too, because a lot of times themes, symbols, plots, etc., narrative content is really determined by the creative choices that you make. It's not always easy to just like read an outline or a structure and then just perfectly apply it to whatever set of ideas and choices you have. A lot of times, for example, it's like I'm not convinced that like Thomas Pynchon read a book before writing The Crying of Lot 49 where it was like how to use water as imagery for the truth. You know, it's like he just made that choice that to Oedipa, the truth is represented by the Pacific Ocean. But after describing the way that this sort of lofty idea means something to her, her character action basically takes a step forward from the theme. So it's not just Thomas Pynchon describing, the Pacific Ocean is like the truth, is it not? He's putting it through the lens of a character belief. He's showing that this is something that means something to her. He's not asking you as a reader to believe it. He's saying Oedipa thinks of the truth this way. And again, it's like we could argue that as the protagonist of the book, what the reader is supposed to take and what the protagonist is supposed to take is the same thing. But in any event, this is a great way to ground this symbolic, lofty theme and put it on Earth, but then also to take it a step forward through her character action. So like we said, not only does she believe this thing, which is described to us in summary, the scenic action that takes place right after that is her traveling to this fake lake. So if we get the symbolic information that's delivered to us in a very lofty way, the character can basically take a step forward based on that lofty information, and based on that lofty information, we as readers can interpret that character action through the lens of that lofty theme. I hope that I was not too abstract when I was describing that right there. And to be perfectly honest, the point of this video is probably a little bit more to talk about my love for Thomas Pynchon and this really cool passage than to specifically help you write better stories. But I named the channel that, and so now I don't know what to do. But generally, too, this idea is pretty consistent throughout the Crying of Lot 49 of the truth being a mitigated thing that isn't really easy to understand. And I've probably exceeded the purview of this video, but keep in mind that this book is called The Crying of Lot 49 and not like the explication of Lot 49 or the rigorous scientific analysis of Lot 49. It is the crying of Lot 49. And so I'm actually not going to analyze that. I'm going to let you chew on that one for yourself. One last little note, like I was saying, most of Thomas Pynchon's work, I think, could be understood through the context of my analysis of that little passage, that it's very much about characters that are trying to find the truth in an uncertain world, and they usually come up short, but if they get anything instead of the truth, I think is maybe a little bit different from book to book, and then also from interpretation to interpretation. So I'm going to stop there. I honestly thought this was going to be a 10-minute video, but here we are. I hope this helps you write better stories, or at least gives you a renewed interest in Thomas Pynchon. So thank you for watching. Have a good one. Bye.